Welcome everybody to yet another edition of Open Book, our Saturday tours of the artist books in this collection and elsewhere. We're especially privileged today to have with us Mark Dimunation. It's just, you know, I get tongue-tied when I'm in the presence of So, and Mark has suggested that we hold a conversation, just a dialogue among people who are interested in the book arts. And so we are departing from our usual format, which is an artist presenting her books and having that recorded for posterity. But instead we are having a number of artists choosing a book that they admire, find interesting, and are presenting to the rest of the people in the room. So with that, I turn it over to Mark to say a few words.
I've done this a couple of times when I was in Iowa for the very creative and energetic program of book arts at University of Iowa. They wanted me to give a seminar to the special collection staff, which just had me roll my eyes like, oh, and I said, why don't we play Stump the Guest? And so we made all the special collection staff bring in books that they would hand to me, and then I was supposed to go through them like some fortune teller. But really what it was a seminar amongst all of us about how to read a book cold. That's really what I wanted to talk about. But I didn't want to do the talking necessarily. So everyone brought in their books, and it was quite humorous. They sat down, and I said, okay, you with the Gehenna book down there, and really the four Gospels, you bring in the four Gospels, those can go. So there was already, I said stump the guest, not, not show off. And so, but it turned into books that, this is where the idea of this came from. So the book is open and the person's flipping through the pages, and I'm saying, well, what do you think? It looks like, this seems like this is a woman, right? And how do we know that? And why are we guessing that? And then, she thinks of herself as a printmaker, not as a typographer, and at least that's my guess. Or she doesn't care about the graphic nature, so she's a printmaker who's making a book about this subject, which is really important. And we're talking, and someone else is saying, no, it's all about da-da-da-da. And it became a real lovely lesson in how to let a book tell you what it's about and be open to it and to have alternative readings. And I found it really a lot of fun. So since then, whenever I have a chance, whether it be one-on-one, where did she go? She's gone. Oh, you're right there.
No, she went away. Someone altogether down.
When Cynthia came by, and it was just this lovely dialogue about books, some of which you knew, others you didn't, and some you liked, some you didn't, and it was a really lovely kind of conversation. And so I found that when you get a group of people together who really love books and have ideas about them or have reacted to something and then are put in a situation where they try to explain, I'm drawn to this because of this, or I think this is what this person is doing, it does a couple of things. We all learn more about that book. We all learn a little more about you, too, especially if you're a book artist and work in your own stuff. But we also learn how to read differently because people look at books differently. And then there's also that shared moment where everyone goes, oh, yeah, look at that. And you realize some books have universal expression that everyone receives, and that's when you know you got a really good book going. So that's the idea behind it. So, and I didn't bring a book because I'm going to sit and listen and talk when the opportunity sets itself straight. So is everyone cool with this?
Yes, sir.
I should be more formal. Is everyone cut?
Yes, Mark.
Is that fine? Is everyone agreeable? Okay. Who wants to jump in first?
I will, if you don't mind.
No, I don't.
Okay. So my book, when I got the invitation, I immediately knew I wanted to share this book which is probably well known to many people here, and there are people, Jane especially, who can give chapter and verse on the backstory of this book. But what I wanted to share, this is Transforming Hate, an artist book by Clarissa Sly. My personal response as an artist who makes books to this object, the title, the content is extremely powerful, extremely important, and I hope everyone gives themselves the gift of spending time quietly reading the whole book. It does deserve that. But what I'm going to share right now is that I'm interested because this object, this book, both confirms and confounds my personal expectation as an artist about, and as a reader, as a viewer of the artist book. Okay, the confirmation, just from the title, Transforming Hate. We can deal with hard, serious content in an artist book in a way that, in my personal opinion, is perhaps more humane than art on the wall, art in installation, sculpture, etc. All due respect to those fabulous forms in which I'm trained. And so is Clarissa Sly. Okay. I'm also confirmed in my observation that artists like Sly, who work in standalone, two-dimensional, three-dimensional work that is out there in big space, have an affinity, their content has an affinity to the artist book. I'm also confirmed as an artist in my gut feeling that a story can be told and be true to life with multiple narratives. Again, going through page by page, we encounter several narratives, some of them set up in typeface, pretty classic. But there's also in this book another narrative that is visual. I'm confounded because all of those things happen in essentially a trade book. Real ordinary paper. Nice paper, good quality, beautiful production, but still, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Real ordinary paper. There's a little bit of textural, like these gold pages have a different texture. So there's a little bit of tactility. But that confounds because my own work and my tendency to look at other work sees the intimacy of the reader's experience of the book as a way to be informed tactily, or by smell, or by the pages being hard to lift, or, we have to think about how to access the information. All those things are metaphors that can support the content. And here we have all this fabulous content and all these multiple streams and all these wonderful things, and you know what I'm saying. Okay, so that's what I wanted to.
It's funny because as soon as you opened it, I thought, oh, that's photo mechanic. I was about to say, is this a trade book? Not that there's anything wrong with a trade book, but when you were showing that, I was thinking, Claire Van Fleet, University of California Press, made a trade edition of Aunt Sally's, of all the books to choose, something with moving parts and layers that you can't reproduce, or die cut even. And the experience of that book is so fundamentally different from I'm surprised she actually went along with it. And so I worry sometimes what's lost in the translation when a trade book is.
That's a very interesting, because I own the trade copy of Aunt Sally, and anyway, that's why I wanted to also. That confounds me, but this is an entirely successful.
Is that made as a private press book as well?
No.
So that's
and
it.
Jane would have all the backstory, but my understanding is no.
And so Clarissa Sly, we were very privileged at the University of Puget Sound to have Clarissa Sly in residency this fall. And this book is a documentation of her experience with the Transforming Hate project, which was a museum project put together by the Holter Museum in Montana, in which artists were given white supremacist materials and we're asked to transform them. So in the opening chapter
Wow.
of this book, she talks about
That
how
would've
those
been a great
boxes
book.
arrived in Asheville, North Carolina, and how they sat in her home for 2 weeks because she couldn't open them up. Clarissa is an African-American artist in her mid-70s who grew up with some very tumultuous times, and many of her earlier works reflect segregation, her family's
Yeah.
difficult
Yeah.
times. And so she talks about that experience, and included in the cover of the book is one gold crane. So her Transforming Hate project for the Holton Museum
Kind of do
was
the Bantam white.
to create a paper crane mobile out of those white supremacist materials.
And this book lives here, so y'all can read it.
And the paper cranes the white supremacist paper cranes were donated to the Collins Library along with several of the white supremacist materials from the Holter Museum, but we'll use those in education and hopefully they'll be showcased in other places in the community.
I used to talk about, this is back, I think, when the book arts movement was a little bit more fractured, or maybe there were islands that hadn't really connected, to keep the motif of our geography. And years and years and years ago, there was a conference at Wellesley. It was called ABC, Artist Book Conference. Were you there? Yeah, and Betty Bright and I were asked to give beginning and end keynotes with the exact same topic, right? It was supposed to be like a bookend. And Betty spoke first and at the beginning of the conference, and I spoke at the end. And I changed my opening to say, here are two people who live building collections about the contemporary artist book movement, and there is not one book that overlaps between the two of us. Not one. And so the talk turned into this sort of discussion of, at that time there was sort of a museum movement and, for lack of a better word, either a fine press or library movement. And the museum movement tended to be multiples, records of events, portfolios, and often produced in a way that made them inexpensive so that many people could have access to the art, and that was the idea behind it. That was right, exactly. And then the library movement, or the people coming from the fine press tradition, was about craft, printmaking, press work, binding, the actual hands-on physical limited edition character of the books, and that they seemed to be going off. And I remember always my frustration when you would start doing research. People would always say 26 Gas Stations is the first artist book made in America. If you don't know, right? So if you don't know Richet's work, it's this museum book, photomechanically glossy photos of 26 gas stations. And recently I gave a talk because Women's Studio Workshop, one of the books that came in the collection that I acquired was something called 26 Plants. And the title page was a mimic of Richet's book, 26 Plants. And there were 26 pages of paper made from the art farm at Women's Studio Workshop, 26 different varieties of paper. And then that prompted me to do research. And over the years, just to show what's happened to this kind of bifurcation and the fun that we make of it now, Richet beat this horse to death. I mean, he had 9 different books that were 6 ashtrays found in a boardroom, swimming pools, right? I mean, after a while it was okay. But some of the new ones were 26 parking lots between my house and Ed Richet's. Right? 25 stores that have nothing in common with each other. It was sort of, they really kind of blasted him out of the water. So, but when I see these books, it's hard not to fall into the bias. I believe, I mean, at least I personally believe it's an artist book, and because it's documenting an expression, and there is. But as you were describing the event and you were talking about the materials being submitted, my first thought is, boy, that would have been an artist book if the real materials could be present, even if it were a one-up. You were lucky to have that exhibition, though.
We were very fortunate.
Yeah, and lucky to have her, too. Go.
Okay, my name's Ed Marquand. My main business is publishing art books for museums, and so this topic is very much always in discussion. And when we're hired for projects, we get calls from museums. The very first question now is, how many do you need? And it used to be that offset books and artist books were very much apart because of the technology. But with digital printing and inkjet printing and all these things, they've really sort of merged and melded in, I think, creatively very interesting ways. But that's, I see that, and I agree with everything you're saying. It's a great opportunity for artists to get books out they never could have afforded if they had had to go the offset route.
I should say, I'm happy to be confounded.
Yeah.
That was, you know, that.
Nothing wrong with being confounded. The book I brought is Mayor Blocker's book on Walla Walla. And Walla Walla is, how many know this book? Okay. How many know Mayor? Okay. Well, Mayor is just a treasure, and she lived for many years in Walla Walla, and it might even be her hometown. I'm not sure. But this is such a Valentine for a place, and I've been to Walla Walla many times, and you know, it's a nice place, but it made me want to fall in love with Walla Walla. And it's all lino. This is the title page here.
Yeah.
The whole thing is an illustration. And the very last page, the colophon, is a cemetery, and all of the information about the printing are on the tombstone.
That's rich. That's good.
And there's a little bit of text, mostly identifying what she's showing, but she starts with this, a true story. My grandfather sold paintings at his booth at the Seattle Center. A woman asked him about one. You must be very proud of this one. Why do you say that? You signed it twice, once in each corner. He chuckled and he says, no, I'm from Walla Walla. And the tune goes, you know, a town so nice they named it twice.
Yeah.
But anyway, they're really beautiful lino prints, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And the nice thing about it is that she's showing famous places in Walla Walla, but also from a different perspective. And then she's showing things you think, next time I go to Walla Walla, I really want to find that.
Yeah.
And it's humorous, it's poignant, it's slightly nostalgic, it's very beautifully produced and beautifully printed. And I just really have been
Very proud.
transported by this book.
Yeah. Yeah.
A recipe.
When did she do it?
She did it, and let's go to a tombstone.
That's really terrific.
Let's see, 2000. Where did it go? There's some dates on here. Alma Inc. 2007. Kimberly Press, 1984.
Those would be the
It doesn't have a
birth
date.
dates,
But her name and her collaborators' names are on these tombstones, and the editioning is right down there.
How many are there?
It's an edition of 50.
Uh-huh.
She's done 600 one-of-a-kinds and 40 editions.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As of last year.
And are the one-of-a-kinds images? Is it printmaking?
There's
Yes.
the red one up there is one of the, they're all lino cuts.
Wow.
And if I could put in a
Sure.
plug, 40
Yeah.
years of Mayor Blocker's work is on display at the Collins Memorial
that's
Library.
right.
An exhibition called Mayor Made, and we will be having that on show until January 19th.
Aha.
So you're all invited, and if you're in town for even a little longer, come on
Well,
down.
the hot news is that you're the center of book arts in America all of a sudden.
Second center.
Who knew?
But the show itself is absolutely amazing, and
Wow.
she has such wit and humor as
Yeah.
well, and
Yeah.
she tells great stories. I found out that she and her husband bought a biker bar,
Yeah.
and I mean, she just has, just these
before
great,
Walla Walla.
yes,
Yeah.
before Walla Walla, and
But it could have been after.
yeah.
She really is she is such a wonderful person. I don't know her that well, but every time you run into her, she feels like some long-lost best friend.
Do you know her well enough to know, is that lettering purposely naive, or
Yeah.
is that
Yes.
just, because some printmakers are just horrible when they start lettering, but do you think that's just to
Yeah.
kind of evoke that kind of
Very much of the
silliness
character
out
of
of
the
it?
illustration.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have, a mayor shared that with me on a panel that Cynthia put together afterwards. She said that when she decided to start a press, she was really inspired by William Blake, who did not want to be dependent on finding a printer. You know, she wanted to be able to do both. So she has consciously, like throughout her entire career, I mean, that's how conscious it is. Does that make any sense? She
Totally.
always,
Yeah.
she's trained herself to carve backwards.
Yeah.
So that she just didn't, so that she, like William Blake, could.
We have
Produce the
we
whole-
have at LC a comprehensive Blake collection, so I get to say that now that you've talked about it. But what you learn from that is he's one of the first people to have developed a notion of printing on demand. And it's because he only had to keep these copper plates in his drawer after he came with this crazy way of doing relief etching. He just had to put the plates in the drawer, and we have a great example of that. And it's because he didn't want to be running around finding, because if you set type, you had to run the entire edition, and if you ran the entire edition, that means you had to have money for the paper, and he wasn't living like that. And two things happen. One is you see his color change over time, over 30 years. And I was once visited by the Blake Society, because we have fairly important copies, and they were up in the Rosenwald room, and these were all, I'm being filmed thin, pale, cardigan-wearing Englishmen who really, 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 really loved Blake. And I opened a book, and shriek is the only word I can use, but there was a shriek behind me, and he turned to his colleague and said, "He has the dusty violet!" And they started to jump up and down together. And I realized there are moments when you can get a little carried away. But what they're reacting to is that there were only moments when that color was introduced, right? And we have a book along this line that's unique, because by the time he printed our copy, he knew that it was not going to be a trilogy. And so instead of the first book of Urizen, ours is the only one that has an extra tree branch. And our copy reads the Book of Urizen. So it's at the very end tail of it. But it's precisely that spirit of it.
No.
She sounds like,
She's fabulous.
yeah, totally. I saw a lot of graphic novel in her too, especially the, what's his name from the 30s?
Mozzarella?
No, but him too. No, never mind.
Drawers and drawers of letterpress.
Oh, really?
She started in letterpress.
And now,
She chooses to carve.
yeah.
And she now teaches at Pacific Lutheran University, which is a liberal arts college in Tacoma, and they've just acquired a historic printing typography collection called the Thornley Collection, which was housed in the West Coast Paper in Renton. And I think it's like a room 3 times the size, just filled with historic type.
Wow. Wow. Great. Thank you. Should we just go around, or does someone want to jump in?
Peggy, how about? Well, I chose Peter's piece, and I unfortunately don't know your last name.
Dimes. I like dimes and nickels.
And I was impressed by this piece right off because I love boxes. And the exterior of the piece struck me because of the sense of stone and yet warm stone. So it seemed like they have a toughness to it. And then the opening is telling you it's like a curtain being drawn and opened. And
Oh.
Could we move the?
Let's move the gun book down, yeah.
Here.
It's very heavy. That book, it's very heavy.
here, I'll hold it.
Thank you.
So I was blown away by just the technique of creating this. They have thick pages that actually open, and you can go from page to page.
What's the title?
The title is it A Great War?
I read for
It's A Great War. The images are from lemonade
Well,
boxes.
my mother had a set of 100 cards of the First World War, and they were produced by a lemonade factory who said, if you collect these, we have a book that you can paste them into, and it will be of value forever. And yes, it is for reasons that probably Howling Lemonade Factory didn't have in mind. So I selected the cards.
So it actually then becomes a theater, and each image is a different act in the theater. So Act 1 is the generals surveying the battlefield. Act 2 is the machinery of the war, the munitions, the cannons, and Act 4 is the front line.
Yeah, 3.
Oh, that's 3.
Yeah.
And 4 is the challenge, fallen cart. And Act 5 is the recovery. So just figuring out how to get all of this to work. He was telling me that these wouldn't have stood up by themselves, but he put a metal, a brass angle inside so they can stand by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that really drew me to the piece is looking at war, and I really liked the melding of the idea with the whole concept, the structure of the piece, which presents it as theater. And I was thinking theater of war.
Yeah,
that's
totally,
that's a
totally.
common thing. And so that made me further think about war as we tend to put it up on the stage as a wonderful, glamorous thing that we can sit back and watch and feel the drama like shock and awe. So I thought putting theater and war together was a really great concept.
How many copies? Just one.
Oh, really? Are the proscenium printed or are they drawn?
They're printed.
All of it's printed.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And to me, the coup de grace is, going through this, and then at the very end, the children playing war,
Uh-huh.
as if it just goes on and on.
And the little,
The Joker.
the Joker.
Yeah.
The only color in the,
Yeah, is that, yeah. In my Civil War collection, I have something called a myriopticon, which is one of those 19th century words that they made up. But it's not unlike what my brother and I used to do as children. My mother would give us a cigar box, I think, and cut a screen out. And then we had pencils, and we would glue Blondie cartoons together in a strip and then turn the crank and they would make a movie. And a myriopticon in the Civil War very much has this kind of proscenium. It's a box, and it's all of the Leslie illustrated news reports of the Civil War, hand-colored, that go by. It's like a movie of the Civil War. But it does what's very striking to me, even from here, about this, which is it's this kind of canonization of moments in the war without any of the travail or bloodshed or damage. It's just the sort of the drum and trumpet of the war, which is, this is really powerfully portraying, as if they're little theatrical bits that you can get up and walk away from.
Yeah, even the last one is the one wounded person recovering.
Right, like the
So
apotheosis of Washington
Right.
flying to heaven. Yeah.
And the picture of the horse, it's a god-awful picture. It's, it's a horse stuck in mud. And when you just, if you have any understanding of what that First World War was like, it's just, well.
Yeah.
We're lucky to have that.
Does this book artist make many one-of-a-kind books?
Yes.
Yes?
Well, with your permission, I'll just follow
It's
up
our show, not mine.
Peggy's piece. This is done by Peggy, and it's a box. And
They didn't know they were choosing each other's pieces.
by the way, yes,
Is that right?
Totally,
Oh, really?
Totally.
So this isn't tit for tat?
No. I chose it, and I ran into her, and then she came and
That's
actually
funny.
very innocently asked me in the bistro about, how did you do that? And I didn't know she was working
Yeah.
on the piece. So it's about me,
Yeah,
let me explain
yeah.
to her.
And you're felling about how detailed her interest in your book.
So this piece is called Urge, and Peggy provides you with the gloves, the quality too.
Yeah.
I would describe Peggy as the Emily Dickinson of book art. She is the totally unknown, publicly unknown person who suddenly brings you an insight into major issues, which all of her pieces do. So here it is. It's comes out like this. Just park this away. And then you open it, and then it reveals itself like this.
Oh.
So I would describe this as it is accessible. You can immediately relate to it. It's highly crafted.
What is his title?
Urge.
Urge.
And it resonates with me because often when you walk through an empty parking lot and there's something growing somewhere in the corner, you think, by God, there's a sign of life here somewhere. In the end, these pieces are, I think, meditation pieces. The quality of it doesn't come from a narration. The quality comes from your meditation on it. It invites you to. She used the word actually in one of her descriptions, inner wakefulness. I think you used that word. You develop a sense of complicity in the issue, and so they are. It has a sacred object approach, which I relate to in my pieces. Generally, I have doors opening, so they are a sanctum, a sacred space that you enter and are asked to contemplate. So that's it.
Is it all plant-like, or are there creatures in there? I can't quite see.
No creatures, as far as I can tell.
So this is just in the sort of control of cement. This urge breaks
Yes,
through.
right.
To me, it's a perfect follow-up to the theater of war. I mean, in a dystopian world, there still is hope.
There's hope, right.
And there is life.
Right.
Could you read the text that Peggy
Okay.
includes with her pieces?
What is this insistence that lies within? Well, everything, and continues no matter what.
Wow.
That is your poetic addition, right?
I see that as an invitation to wonder, and I've witnessed this piece in the gallery with students visiting the museum, and it absolutely does that. Your work, even before they know that the parts have this other magic to them, they are absolutely a place that is an attraction. It's like it's a sucker punch, you draw people in and then you deliver the meaning.
Does the museum display it? Do you get the whole process of the unfolding, or is it?
We have a video.
Perfect.
Oh, and
Because
we've
that's
had
very
the-
dramatic. And you obviously know the book, so when it dropped, you knew what you were doing. But when it dropped, and then you see this thing in the center, and it's like, something.
We've had them activated in the gallery too. When they've been on display, we've had gallery hosts do the activation and
Yeah.
opening them. So.
Yeah.
To me, it was kind of more about temptation. And you try to suppress temptation, and in the end, it just explodes out.
Interesting.
See, and that's my belief that book arts always reveal more about us than we do.
I embrace that definition. Fortunately, all the temptations are virtuous.
There you go. Good for you.
And Frank, I just wanted to underscore or ask, make sure that I was clear. You talked about the meditative invitation that you found, yes?
Yes,
And this,
yeah.
yes. And you said it was in part. You talked about the process, essentially what I would call the process of access.
Yes,
So it's very
right.
accessible, but there's a process
Right.
of access.
It-
Do you want to just say a few more? Because I'm really interested
Well,
in that.
that is, I have that with my boxes.
Mhm, mhm.
Well, that one actually is more narrative than most
see.
of what I make. Most of what I make are doors. They are a stage, or they are well, they are like a sacred spot that requires thought. You know, in other words, it's a contemplative act that it asks. Well, it's what painters try to do by introducing what is it? The linear
Perspective.
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 Linear perspective, yeah.
Now, as all these paintings in the
Mhm.
following the Middle Ages, they found this perspective which put the participant in
it.
as if they are in a window, as if they're looking. So I'm sort of in that quarter, except that I handle a different approach. It's like an icon, or
Yes, okay.
yeah. And I thought Tankai is another,
Mhm.
they're asking you to read the image. And,
Yeah, but then there's this, and because I just think that that's something that's great to hear you talk about it, because it's something that the art book or the artist book also can do, is that there's this physical process that
Right.
it makes it the physical process of preparation for meditation.
Right. This
I
is
mean,
sort of
that
at
sounds
the
really
other
way
end
too academic, but-
of the narrative,
Mhm.
Those are all really involve
Thank you.
a long narrative. This one requires a different way of participation.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Do you know
Thanks.
Do you know the work of Kumi Korf? She's in New York, but she has one book in particular that's just as you were describing, preparing the kind of the universe that you're inviting the reader to step into. She had a book that was circular and opened up into two half-moon spaces, and there were black and white photographic backgrounds of no discernible nature, and these sort of outjuts, and it's just the kind of book that just makes me crazy. Like, what is this? But you then go back to the box, and there's some devices, little implements that you're supposed to use. They're really, you put the first one in, and it's sort of like you're decorating the landscape. You pick up the next, and you realize it's a human. And as soon as you put it into the landscape, it completely changes your reading of that universe, right? And suddenly she's giving you scale. And the poem that comes along with it is all a reference to the notion of the size of the human spirit in relationship to the universe, right? And you get that in that single act of putting that little human in the, and the whole time I'm just grousing about, God, I hate these books, right? And then all of a sudden you have this little spiritual moment. It's really quite wonderful. I love these things that have, that create an inner universe that you can really enter into. I think they're really lovely.
Korff?
K-O-R-F, Korf. Kumi, K.
No double F.
No, Kumi Korf.
Thank you.
The book, and we won't bring that back, but I think you saw how heavy that was, that book, is by Eileen Boxer, and it's called Report Either US or Us. I see that as, report is capitalized, the rest is small letters, and then capital U, capital S, in 2015. And when Amy invited me to do this, like Lou, my mind went immediately to that corner, to that book. And I only knew a little bit about it. I had done, when the show came up, or was set up, I did a drive-by to just look at everything really quickly. And Amy just said to me, this is about all the gun violence in the month of January 2015. And that's all I knew about it. But it just haunted me that it was a weight in the corner there. And so as soon as she asked me, I said, oh, I want to do that one. So it's every gun incident reported for the year 2015, and she had to look for it. There isn't a master list anywhere of what's happening. She had to look for these things. And there are two formats, actually. As I was doing a little research, came and spent some time with it, and Amy provided me with a write-up, and there's another part to this book, or another book. And it's the other book is a unique set of 4 hand-bound volumes, 1 volume per week, 1 incident per page, represent the centerpiece of Report Us. These volumes are hand-bound in hardcover and cloth that is glazed with real blood, and in papers of unfixed red pigment that will bleed when touched, leaving fingerprints as the reader lifts each incident page. And I went, oh my God, here's another aspect of it. But personally, I think that's probably very dramatic and very poignant, but this one actually means more to me in that this set of books is incredible. Back to my notes, I was afraid I would forget something. Okay, from January 1st to January 31st of 2015, there were 3,155 incidents involving a gun in the United States. Not necessarily a shooting, not necessarily a death, but involving a gun. And I would like to read just a couple of these, because once you pick up this book, you have to read the whole thing. And you just can't stop. And the page numbers are just the actual incidents. The first one was a 14-year-old girl remains in critical condition after being hit by stray gunfire while attending a party on New Year's Day. That was the first thing. Celebrating New Year's and you're shot. And the next one I wanted to talk about was page 210. This one, and they're all unique. They're all.
Can you just show what
Yes.
the pages look like?
And she's sort of, I think she's sort of rewritten them to describe them. She doesn't take everything, but this one is the 2nd of January. The Times Square chorus produces a beautiful sound, but it is missing one voice. In Jamaica, Queens, a 27-year-old aspiring singer was shot in the back while on his way to meet with his vocal coach. His classmates want him back to add his voice to theirs. And I can't stop having goosebumps when I read
So
that.
each book is a different
Is
day?
Each
It's
book
a
is
day.
a single
One day in January.
Single day. And the most was January 1st with 180 incidents. And the least was January 12th with 67, just in the month of January. And this is
Wow.
It gives her the vehicle to point out that January 1st is the deadliest day in America.
and that's just incredible. Just a couple more little short ones.
And the reports that you're reading come from where?
She researched them, as far as I understand.
So
She-
there are official texts on death warrants, or
She's-
on death
No,
certificates?
she restated them, but
Yeah.
she did the research. They're actual incidences.
The newspaper
Yes,
For
reports.
yeah.
newspaper,
Yeah,
different
okay.
websites and things.
Not everyone dies in this
Yeah.
book.
On the January 16th, an Albuquerque police officer was shot by another officer in the course of an undercover drug buy. there was some form of miscommunication between the plainclothes cops making the buy and backup officers who arrived at the scene and fired their weapons.
Jeez.
And one more quick one, and this is the last page. Incident 1155, on January 31st, a 61-year-old man died after being shot by his 63-year-old wife during a domestic dispute at a Tulsa apartment complex around 2:15 a.m. Saturday. The couple had a history of domestic abuse, including an active order of protection. So, that's what you find when you start looking at this. Once you know what it is, you don't even have to really look at it. It's an entity in and of itself. The actual book itself is very clean, very spare, black and white. No shades of gray, no color, just black and white, which says something to me about it. This is dated material that is timeless. This is a specific date, and many things that are dated become outdated or funny, and this will never change. The fact that these things happen on this day will never change. 3,000 years from now, those will have happened, and it will not have changed on that date, which struck me as important. The other thing that happened when I thought about this is that I vaguely have heard of the rubber sheet example of the universe, that the universe is sometimes portrayed as a rubber sheet, and a mass is put on it, and it distorts the shape of the universe by this mass. And that's, I'm not even sure I understand that much of it, but I get the picture of it. And I thought that this is the mass in the rubber sheet of our lives. And that's how I think about it in that corner of that display case over there. It distorts our world. Just the fact that this exists, the weight of it, it changes our universe and points out some really awful things. And the actual quote on the rubber sheet is there were some funny word things like report us or US. I thought there was an interesting play on words. But the actual quote is, the way mass produces gravity is analogous to the way a weight placed on the sheet produces a depression around itself. Well, this certainly creates a depression around me. I thought, interesting that that word can be used both ways. And I think that's about it. But I
How
wrote,
many copies in the edition?
it's here someplace, 50?
We both own it, so there's certainly, I think it's a larger.
Yes.
It's I don't know about you, it was an immediate book for me.
Absolutely.
And especially now, I mean, mine arrived long before the last month of activity. There are layers of the experience, I think you're quite right. And one of them is, it reminds you how immune you are to these reports already, that it really takes something physical. It takes somebody who puts up a length of books this long and says every single page represents one moment of gun violence. This is January. And when you look at it that way, it's very hard to escape that kind of dread and panic. I've seen the 4-volume set, which looks like 4 very large. Has anyone else seen this? They look like 4 very large phone books, and they're a rust-colored red. It's a little disturbing when you realize later on that that's blood dyed, but the blood doesn't transfer. But the fly leaves are laminated, and so the the coloring is very friable, and your hands get covered with it, and even just the viewing copy, you can see kind of much like a medieval manuscript where it gets dirty in certain parts. You can see the parts of the book that get held, and you can see when the pages are turned, and there are definite fingerprints, and the book is beginning to bleed, and it's not a mawkish metaphor at all, and it makes you complicit with that, and your fingerprint is on that, and you are responsible for that bloodletting. It's really powerful for me, at least. I think I'm really glad you have it. I'm really glad you have it. I think it's a really, for the simplicity of its design, I think it's just one of the most profound books about violence you could produce.
Mm.
Yeah.
Probably not easy to do, I mean, because it's so loaded. It's
Yeah.
so easily.
And she was like an evangelist on fire at Codex. And this wasn't well, I was trying to imagine how I would represent, it wasn't the usual book interview. It was like, there's a statement, would you like to sign this petition? It was just like, okay. If Book Arts is about the reader committing, this is time to commit. And I think that's kind of, what I was talking about yesterday is Claire Van Fleet says, I make a book that's physical to force the reader to interact with the text. And in many ways, this does that, because you're forced to say what the hell's going on in here. And then once you do, you can't stop. And just when you think, oh, well, this is incidental gun violence. A gun went off and it didn't hit anybody, and the next thing, a 5-year-old is killed. Yeah. And it brings back that kind of, it washes away the hardness of daily life, and and this is about guns and death, and how could anyone? But anyway. Yeah.
And isn't that exciting, though, just in terms of the field of book arts, that the complexity of the interaction, the one route to that reader-viewer interaction through Claire Van Fleet's work, that is a complexity. And then the simplicity does the same thing. I just get very excited just about the potential that the field
It's a very pure
has.
idea. It's a very pure idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a perfect segue.
To flying
the
things.
the pure
Oh,
idea.
okay. That's flying things.
I brought 2 books. They are by each of my children, and they were made by them when they were in school as students of M.J. Linford, who is held within this collection.
Oh, good.
I brought them because, and I think that your point about the books revealing more about the person than maybe the actual books. These books came home, I looked at them, and then I stuck them on my poetry shelf, my collection of books. And they're not books that I pull out on a regular basis to read or, admire my children's work. They've done a lot of things that they've brought home. But when I opened them up and looked at them before bringing them in today, I was struck by a couple of things. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of the beginner's mind and how in interviews with artists and musicians and creative people, a lot of times that's what we're looking for, is that freshness of discovery and trying to present that openness within the work. And I think you get that in these books. I also think that it's interesting to kind of show this lineage that happens. These are not paste papers that I believe my children made. They are, I think, some of the raw materials that MJ had provided. And the formats that are inside, some of them were created as a template that the kids elaborated on, and then some were really left to their own devices. So I wanted to draw attention to a couple.
You can see all of her techniques.
Here, you can, right, it's a little composite, it's a sampler, really. And I especially love this page of flying things because I don't know if you can see, my son still prefers to draw very lightly in pencil as opposed to strong marker drawings. But you see a gate, an extended passenger, what do you call those when you get on the plane?
Gangway.
Yeah, gangway. Onto a plane, and when you rotate this, you see a plane flying.
Wow.
And there's just a very, there's a really lovely simplicity and honesty to some of these things. And the quotes line up nicely with the, concludes with flying animals at the end. So not just technological. You get a little window into his personality, which is still a very technical and gentle 20-year-old kid.
What was their title?
The title is Flying Things.
Flying Things.
Yeah. I want to point out one thing about the book that my daughter made, and she opened to this page, which is the page right in the middle, which really doesn't excite me very much at all. And she said, she opened this up and she showed me this, it's a
Pop-up box.
It's a pop-up box of chocolates, and she explained that she had spent a lot of time developing this, and that she went far outside of the expectations of the class. But it's a real surprise because you just don't see very much of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, a little window into this kid's personality, where you see this very nice exterior, but inside is something much more complex and and rich. So I'm not really trying to elevate these beyond what they are, and I really struggled with the idea of choosing a book because I wanted to come after the museum was closed and root around in the cupboards. Amy, sorry. But then I thought this might be a nice way to ground the conversation.
I'm so glad you chose those. I just was introduced to MJ yesterday. Was that yesterday?
Yeah.
I had a couple of immediate reactions. One is I opened to the first page and I said, "Oh, this is somebody where you really wish they had nicer materials," because she was using lots of printed papers that gave her texture and whatnot, but which were kind of ordinary. But the more you go through, there is this kind of aesthetic of hers, which is familiar and comfortable, quilt-like, maybe homey, and then to see and this amazingly wonderful sense of humor. This is the one that had us all howling. This is her big book of disaster houses. I'm sure you all know her stuff. She's new to me. A big book of disaster houses, and the very first one that just had us laughing for quite a while is called Tsunami House. It still does it for me, right? It still and the more I got used to her and her sensibility, the more I really began to appreciate her work. And her pop-ups are really complex, but she clearly is gifted in passing that on to children. And I think that's ultimately the aesthetic. There's something childlike about her aesthetic that's very playful and yet very technically oriented. She's really fabulous.
She's a hell of a craft.
Yes.
Yeah, no, clearly. And there is, flying out there is one of those quotes about, the true quality of art is to make it look easy, make something hard look easy. And that's what she's doing. Yeah. Those are what treasures those are. Flying things, I like that. There's a poem in there someplace. Who's next? Oh, you want to go? Yeah.
There seems to be a theme running through here. This little book looks so modest, and it promises that it's probably going to be engaging. It's got this little brass heart, but you don't know what that refers to, what kind of feeling, what depth and range there might or might not be in here. It could be a Valentine. You don't know. And you don't know right away why the choice of this color for the box and then for the end papers as well, until you get inside and you see that this has something to do with war. And I'm sure that this color has a reference to blood. It's called Soldier's Heart, and Mari Eckstein-Gower is the artist. She says in an introduction here, which you can open and read or not, you can just plunge into it, but she says that her grandmother told her about a relative coming home from the Civil War with soldier's heart. And then she mentions that her father, after World War II, had terrible nightmares, but he didn't talk about them. He never talked about them. And people didn't talk about their war experiences or what it left them with, and how to heal from that. Now, what she called soldier's heart, her grandmother, we call PTSD. And Mari got curious, and she loves to do research apparently. So she rummaged around and she found all these terms for that. And she did this book. So experiencing it this way, page by page, is one thing, beautiful. Oh yes, I'm hogging it, aren't I?
Oh, you gotta learn to teach upside down.
Yeah, right. Okay, so there's this art. That's what drew me to it in the first place. When I saw it in the gallery, Bainbridge Arts and Crafts, it was displayed this way, you know, pulled out, big accordion, and I could see that it was a frieze. And the color, the beauty, the style of the art is what drew me in immediately. And then when I tuned into the words, just 1 or 2 or 3 words on each page, the different terms for a soldier's heart, for PTSD, I thought, wow, what a simple and direct idea. And then the more time I have spent with it, the deeper my appreciation has gone. Because, as she says in the colophon, she was inspired at first by the Bayeux tapestry. And
Yeah, you can see
so
that.
it's got 3 tiers.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, of course
the
you can see
middle
that.
tier has the main visual narrative.
Yeah.
And then above and below, there's
Yeah.
another tier with commentary or more detail. And I looked at the tapestry online yesterday, and you can see the connection. But she also referred herself to all kinds of visual sources: Egyptian tomb paintings, Assyrian and Babylonian carvings and images, all to do with battle, and Roman carved friezes, Greek pottery. The list goes on and on, including up to the very end, 20th century, 18th to 20th century toy soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what impresses me so much is that she absorbed all of those styles. You can see the influence is pervasive in the art here. And she completely integrated them and made them her own. So looking through this, I feel a sense of a long time passing, a historical time, but also a mythological time. So it kind of has that illo tempore, timeless quality of myth as well. And then I really wanted to hear these words. So I read them out loud to myself. I printed them out and read them out loud. Can I do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Won't take long. Shell shock, traumatisé, en état de choc, combat fatigue, battle reaction, stress response syndrome, stress du combattant, compensation neurosis, estar roto, effort syndrome, Schützengrabenschock, anxious apprehension, nostalgia, Da Costa syndrome, la confusion mentale de la guerre, anxiety disorder, post-traumatica, situation disorder, trastorno de estrés post-traumatico, combat exhaustion, Kriegsneurose, irritable heart, fatigue du combat, compensation sickness, neurasthenia, railway spine, battle fatigue, maladie du pays, nervous shock, homesickness, post-traumatic stress disorder, soldier's heart. So when I take the words
Totally.
out of the visual context and hear them, it becomes like an incantation, like
Yeah.
a prayer. Yeah, and it's all there, and it looks so deceptively beautiful. So
Yes.
Yeah. I have to say, my opinion has really changed from the last viewing, which was yesterday, because Mr. Smarty Pants here didn't even open the front panel to see the introduction, so all I got was this panel, and I got caught up in her
Yes.
illustrative technique, which is not cartoonish, but it's very broad. And I thought, well, okay. And some of the moments along the way, especially homesickness, really struck me with the kind of pathos that. But the bringing in the tapestry immediately alters everything here, because the style to me now reads like embroidery would read, which is much more.
Simplified straight.
Yeah,
Flat
yeah,
shape
like
outline.
Yeah.
with color planes and like a cartoonish kind of quality to it. And then to hear that litany, I'm completely of a different opinion about this piece from yesterday, which is why we keep going back to books and listening to what people have to say about them. It's a lovely
I think
piece.
that kind of stylized style that she absorbed from all these older sources, and the tapestry maybe beginning it, creates a little bit of distance for you, because there are some severed limbs and
Yeah,
things like that
yeah.
shown in here, but it's
Yeah.
not the kind of literal gory
Yeah.
depiction.
Yeah,
That would have been a completely different
yeah.
book.
There's an entire army hanging on spikes at the beginning. I remember, and it gives it that cartoonish kind of. But
But
think
it's
it's
a
also-
sincere book.
Yes.
It's also interesting when you read the different terms for the same thing. Some of them were really descriptive, as if a soldier had coined that phrase, and other ones are more like generals have, or psychologists have.
Oh.
So it's like,
Yeah, which
you know, there's, why is there war? Kind of. You know, like there are these guys fighting it, but then there are these other guys who are putting sort of very mundane sort of titles to these maladies, you know, to this insanity that happens. You know? It's kind of interesting.
There's one here I had to look up because I didn't know what Estar Roto, being broken. That's what that means. Estar Roto.
yeah, I think that's really, it's true. I mean, some of these are very descriptive, some are unbearably dismissive.
Yeah.
Homesickness.
Homesickness.
Yeah, right.
Jim,
Yeah.
when I read that, I just thought, really?
Yeah.
This is the best we can do here? Homesickness. Railway spine obviously refers to some event that, do you know what railway spine? I think I remember the illustrations referencing India, so maybe there's some kind of conflict aboard trains with shooting. Anyway,
He had pointed out that these are all from Western languages. There's no Russian, we notice there's no Arabic, but I think nevertheless, it implies a universality.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that book back out.
Could you, just a question, your first reaction to her style was somewhat dismissive, am I right? I'm fascinated by...
I wasn't I said it wasn't
Dismissive.
my cup of tea,
Right.
because it felt very much like illustration to me.
She's remarkable at
Oh, yeah.
absorbing all these styles
Yeah.
into her own. That
Yeah.
is what
It's just the first run of
Yeah.
it, the color, the black outline, the characters, if you
Yeah.
look at them, they're very simplistic, and you know, the first couple of hits you get is a Trojan horse, and the soldiers are all lying there. You know, there's a kind of humor in there. So I wasn't being dismissive of her work. It's just it wasn't my style, because it felt like illustration to me rather than
more illustrative.
yeah, than printmaking, for
Yeah,
example.
thank
Yeah, but and for me, and maybe this isn't fair to her, but as soon as the Bayeux Tapestry came in, I completely viewed it differently. Maybe I'm not supposed to, but for me, it gave me the avenue into accepting all the simplicity of this style, because it's really doing something else.
I brought a few books, and you can tell me when to stop. I don't collect books, but I got this in trade once, and it's a lovely book. It's called Fragmenta Nova. Do you know this book?
Mm-mm.
Really?
No.
How cool!
At least not so far, I don't. Sometimes it takes me, a couple
Wesley
minutes.
Tanner printed this book.
I do know the book. That's all you had to say.
And I think it's interesting. This book is interesting to me only because it's just drop dead beautiful. It's in Greek. Sorry. And it's Sappho, fragments of Sappho poetry. And there's no English, it's not in English at all. There are notes and stuff, but it's a very sensual book. I mean, it's kind of wonderful. And it appeals to me because of just the design of it, and it's a beautiful book. But also, I really like stuff that I can't understand. I mean, I'm interested in mystery, and I mean, God, that's pretty mysterious, and I just love that. So, many of the books that you guys have been talking about are have a lot of their appeal. They have intellectual appeal. This, to me, doesn't at all. It's a sensual appeal, So, I mean, if you could read this, if I could read this, I might have a different, impression of the intellectual quality of Sappho's poetry, blah, 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 all that stuff. But I don't, and I don't want to. I just love this page. You know what I mean? So, I think there's something to be said, there's a lot to be said for just, hardball beauty. It's really, it's just a beautiful thing.
That's what I say too.
She would like that phrase, actually. But knowing that it's Sappho, there is much to be known without being able to read,
Yeah.
because Sappho is lost, and Sappho only comes to us in small fragments. And every rare book librarian's dream is to be the one that unearths the leather tie that has a missing passage of Sappho. So, what may look, I can't imagine anything harder than having a page that size with 5 words that you have to place on it. How do you do that, right? Aesthetically and with a design sense. But the blank field is complicit here because it's the masked Sappho. Sappho was under that blankness. So you're just putting the puzzle piece where it belongs with the unknown Sappho that someday will come in and fill in all that space. So I think there is poetry in the placement of that besides the poetry itself. Very much unlike Wesley, though, I must say.
No, I know. But it's a great, I love the book.
Yeah.
Okay, that didn't take long. So I got a couple more minutes. This book is called Gifts of the Leaves, and it's a book that was made by Dan Carr and Julia Ferrari, the Galganuza Letter Foundry in New Hampshire. And so Dan Carr and Ferrari. They were
It is a little
married.
unhappy, isn't it?
It does happen. Julia still is alive, and Dan tragically is not. And they made this book together. Julia did paste papers for this book. Dan was a poet and a punch. He was a type designer that made out of hardened steel. He made hardened steel punches for an alphabet that he invented called Regulus. And this book was the first book that was printed in that, with that type. So, Dan wrote the poems, 26 poems, I think. Let me get to the title page. He invented the type, carved the punches, cast the type. Julia made all of the imagery.
Whose calligraphy is that?
It's Dan's.
Is it?
Yeah, yeah. And Julia bound the book. Julia printed the book. She was the press.
Tell me just in
Sorry.
Thank you. Whoa.
So 2 people did, and they didn't make the paper. They kind of, I don't know. Otherwise, it's a beautiful
Send the commercial
thing.
pressman. Slackers, send the commercial pressman.
So it's a beautiful thing, and I've got this book because I'm commissioned to make a binding for it. Yeah, and I've made 2 other ones. So, in these poems are A to Z. So there's 26 poems. It begins with algebra. I think I'm right. Well, where's B? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. No, I'm not. It's not in the title, but it says A. It's about the letter A, and then this one is about the letter, whatever it is, someplace. But look at that Q.
Yeah. It completely undercuts the next
Oh,
line.
it's just amazing. And it's a beautiful
One more
thing.
this way.
It's a great swash tail.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So that's actually not a Q, that's a QU.
Yeah.
Probably, that's a
Yeah,
ligature probably.
Probably.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a beautiful thing, in my view. Dan wrote these poems.
Oh, there's a nice page.
In response to walks that he took in the woods in New Hampshire. And
It's a pity he doesn't like a little bite in the prints. Huh?
right. Yeah. Anyway, it's a beautiful thing. And
I find it so interesting that so far you've chosen 2 very sparse books, which is not you to a big degree.
Yeah, that's true.
And so it's interesting that these are of interest.
No, my style is much more Baroque than this.
Yeah.
Well,
Look
but
how
I mean,
pretty that is.
I chose this because I have it and I can bring it. And the other one,
Do you have any have you been given any expectation of the binding from the person?
no.
So,
But
given the sparseness of it and maybe the playing with the 26 letters, if that's in fact what's going on, do you think any of this kind of emptiness will transfer to the front to the binding itself?
I've made 2 of these before, and they have similarities with each other. And this one will too. So it's sort of in a family, but different members of the family. Because the poems are inspired by walks out in nature at different times of the year. I don't know what I'll do if I have a 5th one, because I've got 4 seasons going. So the first
That
one
would be death.
was spring, second was winter. This has to be fall because the person commissioning this lives in Vermont, and fall colors, I mean, what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
And they have, so I am gonna answer your question. I'm taking my cue mostly from the imagery as opposed to the
Yeah.
sparseness of the page, because it suits me. I mean, it's more what I do.
That would be called a binder's prerogative.
That's right. So let's see if I can find it out. I don't know if they're in
While you're looking, one of the reasons I asked is because those of you who know this gentleman's bindings, what's changed over time is the introduction of brushed metal, which gives texture and layer that used to be more from color and different materials is now on a single. And this is how I'm reading your stuff. So the page in Voyager with the Rumi poems has all this stuff going on, but it's on a single plane and it's done with light catching lines and burnishing and not layering. So I could almost see you doing something that's very minimalist but still have all the kind of decorative overlay that you usually do.
The format of the bindings that I've made before, and the one that it'll be a similar format, is that the imagery, all the stuff that's going to be happening, is confined inside of a frame.
Uh-huh.
And around here is sparse, nice leather.
Yeah.
I mean, just real killer leather. And then inside of here is all the stuff, fall things.
Great. How many books do we have left? Do you want to go and then we can finish with? Is that okay?
I'd be very happy to. So my name is Jane Carlin. I'm a librarian at the University of Puget Sound, which is a small liberal arts college in Tacoma. And I'd first like to thank Cynthia for putting together this wonderful thing. And I also am a little intimidated sitting next to this giant. I told my son last
Giant,
night.
there's a good
I
word.
was-
Thank you very
I was
much.
meeting a rock star of librarians,
Oh,
so it's
God.
quite a privilege for me. And I'd also like to acknowledge MJ Linford. I had the opportunity to work with her this summer, and what I find so wonderful is that she has so much of her work, instructions and guidance online that can be found for enthusiastic book artists. So I am going to end on a slightly different note. I am very moved by all the books that have been shown today, particularly those that reflect social justice issues. But I thought for our visitor that it would be nice to give some reference to our landscape. And so I'm sharing some work of an Olympia-based artist named Alpina Chan. And I do have a small narrative book here that she created early on in her career, which uses family documents, archives, and illustrations to tell her family's journey from China. As a library director and as someone who's building up in archives and special collections at a small liberal arts institution, I really want to engage our students in how they can tell their personal stories and narratives. And I was inspired many years ago by an exhibit that was at the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati called Mining the Lloyd, in which book artists were paired with selected historical materials and created modern narratives. And what we're trying to do at our university is really to engage students in thinking about how they can share their research in new ways, and the book is a format. Malpina spent quite a bit of time in our archives working with the materials of Abby Williams Hill, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but I also thought it was a nice juxtaposition with the artist exhibit out in the main gallery here. Abby was a woman who worked for the railroads, and she was a painter of the West, and she was quite an interesting woman in the sense of she was unconventional. She didn't wear corsets. She dressed in men's clothing. She took her children out into the wilds with her, and she painted these magnificent landscapes of the West. And she was an early advocate for social justice, and one of the leaders in sex education. She met with Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute. So she was a really, really interesting woman, and we're fortunate at the University of Puget Sound to have her paintings in all of our archives, photographs, and diaries. So Malpina spent quite some time in our archives working with her materials. And this is a book that is under under construction, so it's an artist proof. And it's called Mapping the Glacier. And it's all about Abby Williams Hill's experience of spending time on one of Washington's most iconic landscape features, Mount Rainier. And she uses a Turkish fold technique and excerpts from Abby's diary to
Here, I can do it for you.
kind of look there. And basically, it's a very simple book, but it's complex in the fact that she spent so much time learning about Abby and Abby's relationship with the mountain and with the landscape. We are always looking for ways to integrate our archival materials into the curriculum, and we felt that this book really engages the space and place of Mount Rainier, or as we like to call it in this part of the country, Mount Tahoma. The Turkish fold
Is that
map
Anglo versus Indian? Is that what that issue is?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Opens up to reveal the map and handwriting of Abby Williams Hill. Her diaries are very, very extensive, and she really tells strong narratives. I think that this is a very evocative and inventive representation of one of Washington's most iconic features. And she uses old maps that encourages the viewer to think about how the glaciers have changed. So in doing this, she also is helping us think about climate change in our environment and our effect on our community. And we began to think about what Abby's relationship was to the environment as a woman in the early part of the 20th century, what our relationship to the environment is. On the University of Puget Sound campus, on a sunny day, we have a phrase, "the mountain is out." We can see the mountain, so it's very poignant from that point of view. And I consider her using her personal handwriting is also that personal interaction with the book. So I'll just end on that point that we're, extremely aware of the narrative of the Pacific Northwest. Other types of work that Malpina is working on is challenging our interpretation of what happened in Tacoma. There's a terrible part of our history in which the Chinese were marched out of Tacoma, called the Tacoma Method. So many of Malpina's pieces also focus on her own personal identity in the Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
So this is perhaps slightly more positive note in the sense of we're also respecting and remembering the beauty of our landscape.
Yeah, but if it comes from the same genuine spirit as this, it's going to be a very moving book, that as long as it comes from the heart. Do you recognize this structure from Julie Chen's Little Box of Chocolates?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
She has it on a fan fold, and each fan fold has one of these Turkish bursts. But here, you almost, although part of me wants to pop it so that it turns into a mountain, but I understand.
It's like you're inside the mountain. Looking up,
Exactly, like you're looking up into it. Yeah. That's very good. Thank you. Can we end with, what's the red, can we end with the Fitzgerald? What's that?
Sure. This is just a little funny thing that a friend of mine, Joe Newman, made this book, and he caught hell for it because it was. See, it's a very nice. This is the book. It's very nice, and it's called.
Bring it
I'm
down.
sorry.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you.
The book is called. The book is called. It's a blank book. It's called Too Long on Shelves.
Wonderful.
And he was a conservator. And,
Yeah.
I mean, all that stuff. Long on Shelves by
Long on Shelves.
a guy named Two, I think. That's right. Anyway, he caught hell for this from all these serious bookmaker types.
Yeah.
And I saw it at his house, and I told him how much I loved it, and so he gave it to me. Because he says, "You're the only guy."
Yeah. This reminds me, one of the slides I had to cut from my talk is a piece by David Stairs, like as in steps, which is a circular book that has a spiral binding that goes all the way around, and it's called Boundless. Same kind of thing. Yeah.
So this is, I brought this because it's a book that Mark illustrated in his talk last night. It's Epiphanies, James Joyce's Epiphanies. You should just, here, you do it.
No, well, I want you. All right. It would be more fun to hear. I've heard what I think about it.
Yeah, but we haven't.
Okay, so this is a perfect example of what Fitzgerald can do, which is it brings a variety of artists together. But Vincent Fitzgerald is particularly poignant with Joyce, and when I said this, I really did mean it. This is one of the great title pages of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
And the clarity of it, that kind of Matisse-like drawing, the exposure of through the eyes of Joyce, through the dreams of Joyce that's suggested through it, and then Joyce he does a lot of portraits of Joyce. So this on the verso of the title page, you have this lovely stylized Joyce portrait, and then you have the title page for the Epiphanies themselves. So this is a way of introducing this odd kind of text, which is a sequence of dreams, I guess, or they're kind of recognitions, but they seem to come out of sleep, and they're numbered at the beginning. So the beginning with this sequence of colored numbers, which is important because they are going to cluster the Epiphanies into 4 categories, and they will show you that with the colored numbers being listed. But here, for example, number 4, Dublin on Mountjoy, Square Joyce concludes, that's how it begins. That'll be 40,000 pounds, Aunt Lily. Oh, louse. I was like that too when I was a girl. I was sure I'd marry a lord or something. Joyce thinks it's impossible. Is it possible she's comparing herself with me? And there are these little moments that, for a young Joyce, are both revealing of his art and revealing of his failing. That's how I read it. And so they begin. It's you really have to stick with this because already my little book critic is going, gee, this is getting kind of dull, doesn't this? These little pages with it's in portfolio, which to me always says so they don't know a good binder. But you accept it with Vincent Fitzgerald because they know what they're doing, and if he gives you a portfolio, he's giving you a portfolio for a reason, not because he doesn't know how to bind or doesn't know somebody. So each of these folios is 4 of the Epiphanies, and that goes on for quite a while. Right, until we get to 30, that'd be 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, yeah, okay. That should be 40 on the back, yes, good. We're then given the categorization. That's not art, that's just variegation, right? Yeah, okay. And the first of that category is called death. Can you see now the numbers with their colors? So you've read them in sequence as Joyce presents them, and now you're getting the artistic gathering of them. So the first that we confront is death, and this is really just a title sheet, really. So what follows then will be the interpretations, the artistic interpretations of death. This will be hard to lift up, so Mountain may have to come to Muhammad in this part. But these cutaways really play a part. You saw the back and forth of the dance in my slideshow yesterday. In this case, though, can I take this? I'll take this out. It's okay. Yeah. It's a. Are we sewn? Yeah, this is sewn. This whole booklet is sewn, but he's showing us the advantage of being able to cut away. So, and I mean, Could we just pause for a moment and look at the black for just a second? But it starts this way, and of course there's Joyce. But it's also the reference to the 2 pennies in the hand.
Yeah, wow.
So there's this great overlay of portraiture and poetry meeting. So it's Joyce's words, it's also Joyce himself. There's Joyce again. This was a slide I also had to cut. So this is brilliant work, right? And you're promised that from the title page, and it just delivers in my book. Then we get to the, that's not a dance. Go down to the market and show them what a dance is in the middle of a death epiphany. And so you have this dance sequence, which brings us back to the fish that we saw. And then you realize that this is a body with the pennies again. So that's death. Each of these takes on very different characteristics. This is dreams.
And they've given us the color coding.
So
again,
yes,
sorry,
yes,
let me
yes,
just-
yes.
yeah.
So each of the folio pages has its own color.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you now you know why we have a portfolio. Because I can go pull 6, 8, 16, 27, and 28 and have them here while I'm looking at this image. And because he's honoring Joyce's order, where do you illustrate this? You illustrate it at the end and you pull the poems to do it. So it makes perfect sense. And then so I quietly say, I'm very sorry, Vincent. I know you, I know you know how to hire binders, and I didn't mean it. I really didn't. But in this case, although the imagery is different, and there's this lovely use of, this is a technical term I don't know, but
Interference powder?
it's glitter in the ink, but it's interference power, is that what it's called? All right, I'll stick with glitter. Because it's nicer.
That's okay. I just.
But I appreciate that. So here in Dreams, number 16 is actually turned into a cloud itself in the midst of this landscape of a dream, and just sits in the fold out this way. I'm less articulate about this particular piece than the others. Games, again, the same number sequence, 11, 12, 14, 17, and 18. This is games.
When was this done?
98. You have the paperwork right there.
How many copies?
He usually does 50, but I'm not sure with all this cut work what he would do.
50 in the edition. Yeah, I know. 1987.
Like I said, 1987. You know, the interesting thing about these moments is it teaches you how to read the book. So normally I wouldn't go lifting stuff, but I'm clearly being told to. Just by the way we've been introduced to everything in the book, because, right, because there are little universes that pop through in games, and I'm not quite sure what the game reference will be here in the sense, but other than kind of reference to international games. But there's also a very, I don't know if you can see it, a very subtle checkerboard of black on black or gray on gray that's printed throughout. So there's board games being referenced. And if you get the actual Epiphany poems to read, I'm sure there's a metaphor that comes out of Joyce's text that probably talks about my move, or jumping the checker, or something that gives us the reference for this kind of visual interpretation. And the last one is Planes, A-N-E-S. Again with the numbering. And here there's perforations, which will actually cast on both sides. Again, we're playing with this kind of reference that will be completed here.
Oh.
Now it's like a piece of linen clothing, the torn reality of the family and their relationship. Some pencil work actually over the the ruined ideal and their actual experience. So probably the actual kind of planes of experience and the linear that there is no linear experience in life, but it's fractured. So this has everybody and their sister in, and so Daniel Kelleher and Bruce Chandler did the printing, Dan Carr and Julia Ferrari did the type, Jerry Kelly did the calligraphy, Van Dyke did the etching. Ray Burden did the lithography. Zara Partovi, who later goes on to translate to Rumi, did the collage. These are Japanese papers. David Bourbeau, this is all that little coven of bookworkers up in Massachusetts, did the binding, thistle binding, 50 copies. Susan Wilde is obviously the interpreter of this visually. So what I was making the point of yesterday is there were two. If you put women's studio aside because they're really individual artists coming into work, there were two kind of impresarios of book arts that I talked about yesterday. One was Steve Clay at Granary, and the other was Vincent Fitzgerald, and they produced profoundly different books doing exactly the same thing, and some of their people overlap. But Vincent has very much a livre d'artiste quality, carriage trade without being critical. I mean, just a very high-end production, as you can see. Steve Clay is much more, at Granary, is much more likely to say, sure, if you want to bind it in asphalt, that's fine, and if that you think that applies something for the book, go for it, And so these two individuals in New York City are keeping all these people alive with artwork, and they produce this. Both of them have a huge run of books, all of which I think are profoundly successful. I'm really glad you brought this in. Isn't this better than slides? Yeah. I'm so glad everyone got a chance.
I wanted to just mention the first time that I met Vincent Fitzgerald. He was at home in New York in this little tiny apartment, and we came up to visit him, and he was all like gluey and had an apron on and stuff. And he lived there, but he was working, and he was making this book.
Oh.
It's an amazing thing that I learned about him afterwards. He would do whatever it took to get the book made. If that meant sticking stuff on the pages, that's what it meant, and he would do it. And he would go to amazing lengths to get his vision realized. I mean, that's the only thing I think the way to best describe it. And he really, I thought publishers, sat behind a desk and, talked to people on the phone. And he gets his hands, he did and whatever it took. He'd buy, I saw him buying pizza and bringing it to Dan Kelleher so he could keep printing.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Wow.
He just did what it took. He's great that way.
We've known him for years, both of us, but I've known him for several decades now. But he, before Corcoran program got blended into GW, he came to speak to the book art students at the Corcoran. And he's the most modest, most genuine, not quite reticent, but unassuming person. And you'll put these magnificent books in front of him and you'll say, yes, I think this came out okay. And then he'll turn the page and someone will say, how did you do that? And he's incredibly generous with his time. There are no secrets to these books. He'll finish the whole thing and it'll be something like, well, we realized by applying the foil that we had to, stand and hand fan it for 3 hours to make sure that the ink wouldn't cockle on the paper. And then he'll say, do you think it looks okay? And he's just a lovely, lovely man, and nothing makes him happier than to have people like his books. So that actually I had a lot of them, but that moment with him made me go back, and I now have a complete run of Vincent Fitzgerald. because I just really admire his ability to get people to work together. I know that- Whatever it takes.
Sometimes it's a lot.
I'm sure it, yes, yeah. Anyway, thank you for bringing that in.
And thank you all for an extraordinary, almost 2 hours.
That was fun. That was a good idea. Whose idea was this?